So to begin, here I have Nero in this painting that I also showed in the last week's slide in terms of Revelation historical context. And we'll get to why Nero is part of this slide, but it is definitely this his rule is part of what is being narrated and spoken of in a coded language in Revelation. So stay tuned for that. So here we have, I know this is a lot on one screen, but this is the best graphic I could find that fits a ton of history onto one slide. So we're going to start I'm going to not, of course, go over all of this in detail, but it just gives you some general themes of Jewish history up until the writing of Revelation, which we're going to place eventually at the end of the first century. So starting all the way in around 600s BCE. So that stands for before the Common Era, or it's also BC before Christ. But generally, in historian speak, before the Common Era, BCE is what we go by. We have a conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And so there's a destruction of the temple, and there are Jewish leaders taken into exile. And that's happening in the end of the 6th century. And then we have Persian rule up into 332. And then we have, of course, the campaign of Alexander the Great from 333 to 332 BCE. Alexander the Great, as you may recall, has an untimely death in his 30s, and his campaign that has crossed so much of the Mediterranean has yielded a lot of land to be under his control, Macedonian control, except he's dead. So what happens? It's split into major leaders that become major empires around the Mediterranean. And so you'll see that rule of Palestine and the Jews at that time switches hands many, many times, right? So we have the Babylonians, Persians. Alexander the Great comes in, brings in Hellenistic culture, worship, structures, architecture, and then we have a split into kingdoms. Then Palestine is ruled by the Ptolemies, dynasties centered in Egypt. Then the Seleucids centered in Syria. And at the end of that time, there's a revolt by Jewish leaders called the Maccabean Revolt, led by various parts of the family of the Maccabees. And then from there on, Palestine is ruled by Hasmoneans, which is stemming from Jewish background. And then we have Jewish sects, etc. And then, of course, we have Rome. Rome comes in along with the whole takeover, basically, of the Mediterranean by growing Roman power. And then we have Roman imperial rule, beginning with Caesar Augustus with Julius Caesar into Caesar Augustus, and so on and so forth. So we have client kings that are put in place, right? Delegated power over Palestine under Roman rule. So we have Herod, and of course you recall from Christmas stories, he's the king at the time of the birth of Jesus, and then different other rulers of Palestine, Judea, etc., by different client kings and procurators like Pontius Pilate, prefects under Roman rule, right? So they're overseeing that geographic area of Palestine under Roman rule. So we have this change of hands over and over again, exile into return, into destruction of Jerusalem and then revolt, and so on and so forth, rebuilding of a second temple under Herod. And then finally, we have in 70 CE, in the Common Era, or AD, in the year of our Lord, we have the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple again. So just a series of catastrophic, traumatic events in Jewish history and the changing of hands of power. So imagine you're in first century CE, towards the end of it. You, as part of a Jewish diaspora community, have seen and know stories of all sorts of destruction, all sorts of changes of power, never really having true Jewish agency within that area, right? So this is a cyclical, it seems like, series of events in which the power in place goes from all the way from Babylon to Roman rule, right? So those two figures, both of Babylon, that first destruction, and then second destruction under Rome, are going to be key moments of history, especially in the book of Revelation, as it's bringing up all of this trauma and all this destruction, and also gesturing towards ultimate justice, that somehow true rule, that's God's kingdom, that is the distribution of justice and the rule of justice is going to happen, right? So here I'm just setting the stage for all the framing of what this text is going to be talking about, right? So you see the repeat of tragedy, catastrophe, disaster, and rule. So we looked at certain different texts that are of apocalyptic nature last time, and I'm going to just place them on the chart so we can see where those are coming in. So at around 170 to 163 BCE, again, these are our closest guesses in terms of what the text contains. And so where we might place it is we have First Enoch, and that contains different apocalyptic texts, especially the apocalypse of the animals, which speaks of the different changing of hands of rule is allegorized as different animals. And that's also where we get all the animals and beasts of Revelation, is copying this kind of allegorical speak of change of hands of power will be represented by different animals or different metals or different signs and symbols. Then you might be, when we have the death of Antiochus in 164 BCE, Antiochus Epiphanes is probably one of the most vilified and horrible rulers of Palestine under the Seleucids. So he's a Syrian ruler of the place, and he desecrated the temple. He forbid Jewish worship. He's the main villain of the Maccabean revolt, right? And so right around that time, we have the Maccabean revolt, and then we have also the composition of the book of Daniel right around that time. So all the apocalyptic visions that Daniel has, the dreams he has, involves all the events leading up to and in the midst of Maccabean revolt. And then we have, after the Maccabean revolt and all of this, we have a flourishing of different sects of Judaism, which include, you might be familiar with mention of the Essenes, which are seen as an ascetic group, sometimes associated with the Qumran community by the Dead Sea, and where we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have, of course, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, the Sicarii, which are possibly zealots, political insurrectionists at the time. And of course, you can include in this the Jesus movement, right? So after Jesus' ministry on earth and after his crucifixion, there is a rise of what can be seen as a sect as well, right? If we really put it within its historical context, it's not that Christianity just arose right out of nothing, but really grew in the beginning as a Jewish sect that began around the time when there's lots of debate about how to be a Jew, how to follow the Torah, how to understand God's covenant with the Jewish people. And all of that within the context of a lot of trauma. And so Jesus and his debates with different rabbis, Pharisees in the Gospels, right, as a rabbi, is also participating in that cultural, political negotiation of how do we be faithful, obedient Jews. And his following after his death is part of a different sect, right, of the Jesus movement. And then on the far right-hand side, we have the destruction of the temple, as I've mentioned, under Titus and Vespasian. So Titus marches in after a siege, has the temple sacked, and Jerusalem, the city, also destroyed. And Vespasian is Caesar at that time. And then we have the rule of Domitian, which is usually where scholars have a general consensus of when the Revelation of John is written. So maybe around 95 CE under Domitian, who's ruling. He's one of the Flavians of the Flavius family, including Titus and Vespasian. So this is post 70 CE, post destruction of the temple. And I'll get to why we think that that's the date in just a second. So here's the whole swath of history leading up to where I put the star is probably where we can locate the writing, the time of writing of our book, Revelation. And what about its author? What can we tell from the authorship from within the book? So, first of all, in chapter 1, verse 1, we have the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So the text names very clearly that somebody named John is the one who has seen these visions and is now passing this on in narrative written down form, right? So that's curious because this is one where it's not anonymous per se, right? Because it names John. And that's sometimes done, not always, but apocalypses in a lot of Jewish Christian literature is oftentimes um, attributed to or given the name of, for example, Enoch or Abraham, where it's a mythic figure, a legendary figure from Jewish history. And here, that's not quite the case. And in fact, the narrative gives it the name itself to a servant John. John who? We'll see. Again, in verse 4, John to the seven churches that are in Asia. And then again in verse 9, I, John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the persecution and the kingdom and the patient endurance. Here we have a location, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So more detail is given even not only of the geographic location of Patmos, but also of situation, right? Saying that this person, whoever he is relating to his audience as a fellow believer, a fellow sharer of persecution of some sort of tribulation. So empathetic in that particular way to whomever he is writing to. So possibilities, John. There's actually, if you look, a Wikipedia page of people named John in the New Testament. There are that many Johns. So which John are we talking about? So we have John, one of the sons of Zebedee, right? So James and John, we're told, are Jesus' disciple, part of a duo in Jesus' disciples. So they're brothers, sons of Zebedee, or also called the sons of thunder for some reason. We're not quite sure why in the Gospel of Mark. So that's one John. There's also John, who could be the same John in tradition of the writing of the Gospel of John, usually understood as the beloved disciple of Jesus in the Gospel of John. So that's usually understood as probably John, son of Zebedee, in tradition, right? Also, again, we don't know. We also have the writings of the Johannine writings of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John at the end of the New Testament. And of course, this author in Revelation. So there's lots of Johns to choose from. Are they the same? Are they different? We don't know again. But we have that as a possibility, John, son of Zebedee. And then to make this even more complicated, we have a mention of somebody called John the Elder, also John the Presbyter, that's another way to say elder, named in early texts by Papias and then quoted in Eusebius, who's writing church history centuries later, right? And this is distinct from the Apostle John. And this person is named also John, so a possibility of who that might be. But again, we don't know, right? So actually, of all the texts that we have in the New Testament, we have attribution and traditions of it, but coming later than all the texts, except for the Pauline letters, in which we have Paul naming himself. These are epistles that actually circulated. So that's one author that we have. The only one really that we can speak of with certainty in the scholarly realm of who that person is. So the author is unknown, but calls himself John in these particular ways within the letter. What about in terms of date? Can we figure out from the text what date this is written in? So we have, according to the church father Irenaeus writing, we have Irenaeus saying that this is a testimony written under Domitian, right? So if we quote Irenaeus and go by his judgment, Domitian's reign goes from 81 to 96 CE. So that's the possible range if we go by that particular understanding. And actually, from what we can tell, it's not, it's quite likely that this is the actual date, the one that Irenaeus gives us. So we have, where do we judge from? So if you read through the text carefully and try to match it up with what is happening in history at that moment, that's one possibility, right? So one thing is the use of Babylon to name Rome. So for a couple of reasons. What's happening in Rome and what's happening under Rome to give it that allegorical name, to compare it to as evil a power within Jewish history, right, and perspective as Babylon, which created that exile and first destruction of the temple, right? So one clue we have is in 79 CE, we have the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, right? So in chapter 8 of Revelation, we have a great mountain, it said, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea. Is this a reference to that eruption, right? So that's one date that we give that is post CE. Maybe it's referring to this geologic event that was a catastrophe. And another is a possible reference to the siege of Jerusalem by Titus under Vespasian in 70 CE with the destruction of the temple, right? So in chapter 11 of Revelation, it says, they will trample over the holy city, understood as Jerusalem, for 42 months. Does that point to the 3.5 years that Jerusalem is under siege and then taken over? So these are ways that historians might try to figure out and match the coded language of Revelation to what's happening in history at that time for Rome. The other thing is that authorship does not necessarily function in the way we might think of in the modern world. So it's not as if you write a draft, you revise it, you send it to a publisher, it's under you, and then it goes out as one piece. Are there collections of material here that are compiled so that we have, maybe the letter to the 7 churches in Asia Minor come from a different date than the visions in these cycles of 7, and then possibly, certain songs and hymns that are included in Revelation might be written and used in liturgy or whatever in different times, right? So it could be a compilation of different pieces put together, compiled at one time, but gathered from different time periods. That's also quite possible. And we see that happening, in quotations. We see that happening in other places in the New Testament where we might have pieces of Mark, right, obviously being used in Matthew or being used in Luke, right? So in which composition and compilation are not the same. So that complicates it even more. But roughly speaking, given what we find within the text to speak of what's happening in history, and also what Irenaeus says is part of tradition, it's likely that it's written under Domitian, or at least towards the end of the 1st century. Okay, so then another thing that we might use is the prophecies themselves within Revelation. So one very telling allegory. Remember I said that the beasts and other visions will allegorize what's happening under Roman rule, and a series of rulers are signified by certain symbols and images, right? So in chapter 17, we have this. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Also, they are 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain only a little while. As for the beast that it was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7 and it goes to destruction. This is pretty confusing, right? And I don't blame you if you think this doesn't make this gibberish, right? You can try to decipher this and match it to different Roman emperors of the time. And why would we do that? Well, for one thing, 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. Look to the coin on the bottom right-hand side, right? So you see the goddess Roma, which represents Rome, right? As part of civic religion and understanding. There she is. That's the city of Rome represented by a woman. And what is she sitting on? She's sitting on hills or mountains, right? And Rome is a city built on mountains, understood as 7 mountains. And so she's seated there. So the coded language of chapter 17 is talking about Rome, and also 7 kings of Rome, understood as the Roman Empire. So here's one of many possibilities. As you know, we can allegorize and match up and decode in different ways, but here's one way of doing it. So if we follow the text, we have Augustus coming after Julius Caesar as the first king or emperor, right? So these have died. If we understood writing at maybe the time of Domitian, we have 5 kings that have already died, right? 5 have fallen, right? Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, Nero. We're going to skip over Galba, Otho, Vitellius, the year of the 3 Caesars, right? Then we're going to go with the time within the prophecy is possibly of Vespasian, right? This is uh, the time of this particular prophecy, not when it's written, but the time it's pretending it is, whether it is or not, as Vespasian. And then only a little while that lasts is Titus, right? He only is reigning for 79 to 81. And then finally, at the time of writing, possibly Domitian, right? That he must remain only a little while, Titus, and then the eighth Domitian belongs to the seven that's come before. So what we call this is if John, whoever he is writing under Domitian, he's prophesying what's going to happen, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. That's called prophecy ex eventu. This is not taking it on faith that prophecy of the future actually exists, but rather this is written at the time of Domitian, looking back and writing prophecy of things that all have already happened so that it matches. So this is one way that scholars have understood from a historical viewpoint what's the decoding of chapter 17, verse 7. One way of understanding these seven heads, the seven kings sitting on the mountains of Rome. So this is another reason why to place the date of Revelation under the reign of Domitian, 81 to 96. What about the situation? Okay, author uncertain, date possibly 95 CE, let's say. Okay, then what's happening at this time? Into what context is this narrator writing, and do these visions, what are they supposed to, what is the situation on the ground? So we have clues within the text itself. This is all our internal evidence. So we have lots of mention of troubles and persecution, right? So we have in chapter 2, Antipas, my witness, who was killed among you. Seems like some sort of martyrdom, violence happening. We don't know how far widespread, but we have the naming of a person who is a witness who has been killed. And then chapter 20, this is now towards the end, right? Towards the judgment. I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. So mentioning of martyred peoples who were beheaded for their faith, some reason. The problem with this, though, is that we don't have hard evidence for a systemic and widely applied persecution under Domitian, right? So we do have definitely social ostracization, the understanding that Christians or the strange sect, Jesus followers at the time, were excluded in particular ways, possibly spots of violence and persecution. But it wasn't as if there was a empire-wide systemic persecution that you might be led to believe, right, by reading this. So it's debated of how widespread or how systematic it was. But there does seem to be some thing happening at the time that we do have oppression, violence happening in certain communities. So as I've said, we have in chapter 12 and 13, there's the mention or allusion, right, of getting the mark of the beast. This is a notorious section in which people are branded with the mark of the beast, and they have to do that in order to buy and sell. So there does seem to be some way of excluding communities or reference to, allusion to not being able to participate in commerce or in marketplace and exchanges socially, possibly because of how one worships. So that might be something. Then we do have, again, the mention to a threat to Jerusalem. Maybe this is looking back at 70 CE. This is the trampling for 42 months as a possibility. And then we'll get into this in just a second. There is definitely, it seems like, a need to separate out who are true believers, true, faithful, obedient followers of this movement as versus those who are false, right? So there's a label of a synagogue as the synagogue of Satan. There's also the mention of false prophets. So this is also of a piece of what we see with early Christian literature in the first century, right? In which we have mentions of beliefs and sects that faithful communities should be warned off from, false teachers, false preachers, false wandering teachers as well that need to be rejected, right? So there is definitely a moment of you need to differentiate. You do not believe in these things. These are false. These are not authentic. So there's a line being drawn definitely within the book of Revelation that's part of the concern of the author that's being expressed in this book. Okay, so the best evidence we have for this situation, of course, is the letter to the seven churches. And that comes in chapters 2 to 3. So the seven churches, we have Smyrna, Ephesus, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. You see that laid out, right, in this geographic area of Asia Minor, now modern Turkey. And then Patmos is an island off the coast of Asia Minor, right? So we have the narrator placing himself facing Asia Minor from his place in exile, which is also a mark, right, of being a faithful witness, that he's been exiled, he's been persecuted in some way. So even his geographic location is part of his stance of, look, I have been faithful, I am a witness to all this, and I share in any of the persecution that you've been subjected to, because look at where I am. And then writing towards Asia Minor, where the circle of communities exists, in which we hear described and transcribed different letters that the Son of Man appearing is then delivering, right? So these messages that John is writing down is directly from God to Asia Minor. And so what is it that we say into, what we hear him say into these things? So most of what we see within these letters, this epistle form to the seven churches, is how to be within this cultural environment, right? In which you have this long history of persecution, or not persecution, but oppression and change of power, possible spots of persecution, social ostracization under the Roman Empire, in Jewish diaspora, probably, in these communities that are now even more minoritized as this Jesus movement, right? They're not part of a greater Jewish community and not part of the greater Greco-Roman community either. So one of the themes of the seven letters is the recognition. This is where the Son of Man, Christ, is saying, I see what you have done. That is good. I recognize that. So we have, first of all, to Ephesus, for example, I know your works, your toil and your endurance, or you're holding fast to my name. You did not deny your faith to me, in Pergamum. And then also for Philadelphia, you've kept my word and have not denied my name. So you can kind of right, infer from this that there's something about, if you deny a name or if you deny a faith, right, there may be some motivation to do that within these historical contexts, right, in which if you said, oh, I'm not part of the Jesus movement, or I don't recognize Jesus as Christ, as Messiah, or as Savior in these particular ways, then you could maybe have greater social standing, greater acceptance, connection networks, right? But this is a recognition of not denying and holding fast and enduring in these particular ways. We also have a warning against heresies, I've mentioned. So popping up of clues as to what's happening in terms of what's being rejected in Revelation as false teaching, right? So in the letter to those who are in Ephesus, this is to your credit. You hate the work of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. We don't know what this particular group held to or what the teaching was, but there's a name, possibly under something like Nicolaus or something like that, that's being named as a group of following that you're supposed to reject and hate. Also, you have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam. Here, this is a reference to a chapter of history from the book of Numbers. You can look it up, in which Balaam is a not Israelite, but prophet who is going to prophesy, but he's being blamed for different things like idolatry and sexual immorality in later understandings of the Balaam story. And then also, if to the letter to Thyatira, you tolerate. This is a warning and also a rebuke, right? You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. Jezebel is a code name here, borrowing from Israelite history from the Book of Kings, right? Of the woman who was married to King Ahab, who then brought in idols for Baal and also priests to Baal and made sacrifices, right? So promoting idolatry, and not just idolatry, but she's also associated with sexual immorality. So here we have interesting, right? Nicolaitans, which sounds Greek in name, and then also two references to Israelite history as code names for false teachers or those who are leading particular communities astray. So this tells you something about the cultural mix by looking at these names, but also referencing these chapters of Israelite history to warn and also to rebuke, right? To admonish these particular communities as well against heresy. Um, and then we have, well, what would be unfaithful, right? What should you not be doing? Not only just the names of these particular heresies, but beliefs or practices. So we have greater detail to Pergamum, Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that what they would eat food sacrificed to idols and engage in sexual immorality. So those are the two sins associated with that. Similarly, with Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet and is teaching and beguiling my servants to engage in sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. Again, those are the sticking points, right, that are being warned against in the letters. Beyond that, right, beyond these beliefs and practices that are forbidden, and cursed, we also have to start us if you do not wake up, right? So there is the sense that if you become complacent, if you become too content, if you're not active, if you're not following in an active way, right? You need to wake up, and that's the warning. And then we also have another sign of social contentment and assimilation and and not being awake, which is you say, I'm rich, I have prospered, right? So there's nothing more to do, and I'm fine. There's a contentment that is not conscious of the warnings that the seer of Revelation of John of Patmos is trying to communicate, right? So these are the ways that these social communities are being warned, and the beliefs that they're being warned off of. Um, and if they are able to follow obedient, there's also a list of rewards. And these are quite diverse and interesting of the kinds of rewards that you can get for being awake, for being faithful, for holding fast, for not denying the name. So, for example, to Ephesus, to everyone who conquers understood as being faithful and obedient, as far as you can tell from the text. I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. Okay, that's really interesting. We have the tree of life borrowed from the Garden of Eden from the book of Genesis as giving eternal life or abundant life. That's also referenced in Revelation 22, the very end of the book, when we see the descent of the New Jerusalem, the description of the city in which we have the tree of life bearing its fruit and its leaves in season along the river of life. So, understood here, if you understand the bookends of the text, right? If you've conquered, then you can enter the New Jerusalem and live there and also have a share of the tree of life. Here, similarly to Smyrna, whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. Here, you can understand this possibly as if you go through the judgment of the dead, if you're going to connect us to the end of the book, right, you will not then be thrown into the lake of fire and then eternally annihilated. This is up to interpretation, but this is one way to understand this verse. And then also, then if you're not thrown into the lake of fire and suffer the second death after the mortal death, then you can also become a citizen of the New Jerusalem, right? A part of the heavenly city that descends. To Pergamum, the promise is to everyone who conquers, again, conquer being the repetitive action that needs to be taken. I will give, and this is really interesting, some of the hidden manna. So this is hearkening back to Israelite travel in the wilderness, the gathering of manna as the food given from God from heaven. And I will give a white stone, and on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. So here we have something that might be from cultic practice or understanding of initiation, something that is hidden, that is revealed, secret name. White stone also linked with different understandings of cultic practice and prophecy, also secret name. New name we also have through Israelite and Jewish prophecy of I will give you a new name, right? So new sense of renewal, new identity that's being given. So this is slightly different shaded understanding of reward, also interesting to look into. And more of these. So I will give, it gets even better. Authority over the nations is one of them. And to the one who conquers, I will also give the morning star. could be also symbolic promise on many different levels. We have morning star being associated with divine, Son of Man, Jesus, but then also, of course, a rule, political rule, governmental rule over the nations as a promise as well. So power now as part of that. And then in Sardis, the promise is you will be clothed like them in white robes, and I will not erase your name from the book of life. So one is being clothed in white robes. White robes, if you look through the book of Revelation, are everywhere. It's interesting to see who gets to wear white robes. There are the martyrs and the witnesses who have, interestingly, washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb, which you would think would make it really dirty, but actually is this super high powered detergent that makes it very dazzlingly white. So that's part of the whole understanding is you need to wash in the blood of the Lamb in order to be clothed in white. And then we see people clothed in white that are part of the New Jerusalem. And in fact, you cannot enter the gates unless you've washed your robes. It says they are the ones who've entered the gates are the ones who have washed their robes. So this whole preoccupation with clean laundry, I'm just being facetious here, but definitely a part of understanding of being saved, right? So these symbolic colors and dress are also part of it. You might also want to contrast this with the robes of the Whore of Babylon, for example. What is she dressed in? She's dressed in red, scarlet, purple, right? So understanding that is the opposite, the contrast of the white robes of those who get to enter the city. At any rate, we have this as another reward that is tied to citizenship, as I've said, because their name is in the book of life. You can understand the book of life as comparable to ancient citizenship lists in which you, if you're in it, you are a citizen, right? So then this equation is you belong to the kingdom after the second death. And then finally, this is interesting. I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God. And again, writing is part of this. I will write on you the name of my God and the name of the city of my God and my own name. So here we have you are part of the pillar, the architecture of the temple. This corresponds with other symbolism in parts of the New Testament. For example, you are living stones in First Peter, or other parts of being part of the New Jerusalem, right? So you have the foundations named after the 12 tribes of Israel, and then you have the gates being named after the 12 apostles, right? So here you get a pillar that is you, right? But understood also named for you. So part of that structure, literally, symbolically, of the New Jerusalem. And another reward is having on you written the name of God. That should call to mind being branded by the mark of the beast. So the opposite of that would be having God's name, the name of the city of my God, and my own name written on you so that you belong, right? In some way, practice of enslavement, unfortunately, of branding, right? Of being belonging to a master, here in this case, belonging to God, and then also having the right to enter the city of God. So we see all sorts of mix of cultural, political, theological promises in these symbolic rewards that are being promised if they remain faithful, if they don't deny Jesus' name, and if they are able to wake up, right, and heed the warnings that are given to the seven churches. I'm also placed with me on my throne, part of the rule. So with that, right, what we can see gathered from the letters to the seven churches, right? What can we conclude about what's happening with the situation here? So, as I've said, imagine that there's this dominant Greco-Roman society, right, through the Mediterranean area and in Asia Minor, definitely, under Roman Empire, under Roman rule, with Hellenistic culture pervasive throughout, right, for centuries at this point, right? And here we have things associated with dominant Greco-Roman society. So we have a civic cult, right, in which you would participate of sacrifices to the city's gods, in which you might say oaths, or you might be initiated into a mystery cult that's part of Mediterranean worship. So, for example, cult practices for the goddess Isis, or for the Magna Mater, or for other mystery cults like Mithras, etc., right? Then we also have sacrifices in these particular cults of bulls and lambs, sheep. And that meat that is offered in those sacrifices after the blood has been spilt is then sold in the marketplace, right? So that's one of the major preoccupations that we saw, right? Not a modern preoccupation you necessarily have today when you go to the grocery store. You're not worried that the meat you're buying comes from an idol sacrifice, but that is the case when you're going to the marketplace, right? In Asia Minor, and you think, was this meat, right? Because part of the ecosystem of marketplaces of having meat sacrificed to idols. And that's why Paul is so concerned in all his epistles about that, right? So that's one big thing of living in this dominant society, this Greco-Roman dominant society. And also there's the stereotypical understanding of Gentiles from a Jewish point of view is that those who are not part of Jewish worship are worshiping idols, right? When they're part of mystery cults, when they're sacrificing to Roma, when they're sacrificing to Jupiter, right, in the Capitoline Hill, all of that is part of idolatry. And then also practices within Greco-Roman society in which you have pederasty between mentors and students, when you have sexual relations of a master with their enslaved peoples, that understanding of what's allowed within this greater society from a Jewish viewpoint is all sexual immorality, right? And so here, if you are a Jew within that, right, how are you going to operate, not assimilate, not practice, not buy, not participate in all of these things, right? It becomes a social challenge because you're shutting yourself off from a lot of different things. So here is the dominant Greco-Roman society, within which we have the minority group. I say not to scale because I'm not doing this by like population sizes, but at any rate, within this group is minority Jewish communities. And here we're thinking specifically of Asia Minor, right? So we have questions of how to follow Torah, how to worship obediently, being circumcised as being a major identity marker with this. How are you going to follow food laws? How loosely, how not? And that's why you see when Paul's writing to churches in Asia Minor about 30 years before the writing of Revelation, these are also like major preoccupations of how are you a faithful person, right? Within a sect that's one of the main identities is coming from Judaism, right? Or operating within Jewishness, of being within the society that has very different ideas about how to be faithful, how to worship, how to eat, how to participate, how to have sexual relationships, right? So here you are. And then even within that, then you have Jesus movement communities, church in Sardis, church in Pergamum, church in Ephesus. How are you going to do that? Especially when you're even weirder from the outside perspective. Not only are you understood Jewish, right? Jewish, but you're also worshiping somebody named Jesus, right, as the Christ, who is understood as crucified because of political insurrectionist behavior. You also have a pretty idiosyncratic interpretation of Torah as a Jewish community or movement in which you might not follow food laws in quite the same way, or your viewpoint from circumcision is being told by this, anti, seemingly from the outside as anti-law Paul, right? So here we have an even smaller minoritized group within Asia Minor trying to move within identity of Jewish, probably, possibly, right? Especially from the author's viewpoint, operating within dominant Greco-Roman society. So you see all the conflicts that are possible popping up within the 7 letters saying, this is the synagogue of Satan. Don't do this, don't do that. You need to wake up. Don't assimilate, right? There's a very hard line. Do not assimilate to this rest of society, even within other Jewish communities within Asia Minor. So here we can see kind of the social situation around the date and by mysterious author. Finally, all of this speaks into then understanding these things historically. We have what's pictured and envisioned as an act of justice, the destruction of earthly empire. And I'm going to go through this, but we have allusions to Babylon as this great city that rules over the kings of the earth, so understood as Rome. And then within that, we have coded language that points to Nero as one of the greatest villains, right? So let anyone with understanding, this is a breaking of the fourth wall directly to the audience. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast. It is the number of a person. Its number is 666. I won't go into gematria too much, the numerology of matching letters, Hebrew letters to numbers. But if you spell it out in Hebrew for the Greek, Neron and Caesar, so Caesar, Nero, it adds up to 666. There's also a textual variant of other ancient manuscripts, say 616, so the number is different. But if you do Hebrew transcription of the Latin, it's 616. So it works out in Latin as well, if you do 616 or 666. So anyways, it's coded for Nero, who is horrible and blamed the Christians for a fire in Rome, supposedly lit and poured fuel on some Christians and lit them as human torches, basically, right? So a valid candidate for this particular villain in Revelation. Beyond the destruction, we also have envisioned, right, the revelation of God and his kingdom. And so we have the throne over and over again, the lamb who is slaughtered sitting on the throne, and then the river of life flowing from the throne, the seated on the throne being given glory and praise. So this is saying everything that you know of the politics and the history of this time is not the real, right? The reality is God's kingdom. And I'm going to paint a picture of what that actually looks like, right? Of God sitting on the throne. And ultimately, there will be justice, right? So the final end to all of this before New Jerusalem comes down is the judgment of the dead, so that all the catastrophes and disaster and the injustice and the oppression and the exile and the destruction will be judged. So it gives that theologically, politically satisfying, I would say, end, right, teleology of this judgment that God is then going to impose onto all the dead. All right, I will stop there for historical context. And I can't promise to be able to answer all your questions, but happy to see what they are.